The Jets are the rare team that dreams of winning the Super Bowl on the backs of its defense. How do the Jets compare with a recent team that won the Super Bowl on the back of its defense? We'll talk about that today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, July 18th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on Podcast Source, please give it a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs have wound down, the sports have stopped sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Today we have a mailbag show, and you may be wondering, well, hey, usually we do the mailbag shows on Wednesday. We just did a mailbag show yesterday. We're going to do a special mailbag today. So there are two ways you can send me mailbag questions. One of them is you can just email me directly. The other is every week I put up a post on my website, GanggreenNation.com, asking for readers and listeners to submit questions for this week's mailbag. Well, this week when I did that, I put up the post asking for questions. One listener wrote that he always forgets to list questions. He always misses the mailbag call whenever I put it up. So he had a list of questions that he wrote down. So I'm gonna dedicate this mailbag to this one listener who has missed the opportunity to post mailbags for apparently weeks, and just had a bunch of questions. So this one's for you because we haven't gotten to any of your questions in the past, apparently, because of just timing things. So thank you so much for listening. I appreciate all of you listeners. Let's get started. Our first question in this special mailbag. How do you think these Jets and old Aaron Rodgers compare to the Broncos team that won the Super Bowl with a compromised Peyton Manning? I think we are better on paper with more injury risk concerns. I think it's a little different. So, as great as this Jets defense is, and as great as this Jets defense will be, and I really think highly of this Jets defense. This is in no way to disparage the 2024 New York Jets defense because they are loaded with talent. You want to talk defensive line. We're going to assume Hassan Reddick's eventually going to sign. Jermaine Johnson coming off a Pro Bowl season, the best player on the defensive line. Quinnen Williams are hoping for a breakout from Will McDonald. A linebacker duo, which could be the top 1-2 linebacker duo in the NFL, which, amazing to be saying that, thinking about how much concern there was about this group a year ago, but Quincy Williams, CJ Mosley, outstanding duo. I'd say the top corner trio in the NFL, Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, Michael Carter II. I mean, if everybody stays healthy, this should be a phenomenal defense. Safety's a bit up in the air, but if your biggest worry is that your safeties are solid, which I think the Jets safeties are solid, you're in good shape. So I mean, nothing to disparage this phenomenal Jets defense, but I think Denver's defense in 2015 was better. I mean, the Denver Broncos in 2015 finished first in the league, like across the board. They finished first in points allowed. They finished first in yards allowed. They finished first in passing yards allowed. They finished first in net yards per attempt allowed in the passing game. They finished first in yards allowed on defense. I mean, this was a phenomenal defense Denver had in 2015. And they carried an offense that really was not very good. The Denver offense finished 19th in the league in scoring, and Peyton Manning, was maybe the worst quarterback in the NFL that year. He was awful in 2015. It was his final season in the NFL, and we all kind of looked past it because it just felt like things were evening out because Peyton Manning had so many great seasons in Indianapolis and Denver. And he should have won a second Super Bowl somewhere along the way. So I feel like we were all just fine with it. And I'm still fine with it today. We're all just fine with, what? He was horrible this year, but he got a second ring. He probably should have had a second ring somewhere else along the way. So we'll just call this a lifetime achievement award. But Peyton Manning really did not do a whole lot for that team that year. When they got to the playoffs, Manning played smart. He got the team in the right play call, and the offense did just enough. But that team was absolutely carried across the finish line by its defense. I think this Jets team is going to look for more balance. Now, I do think that the defense is the dominant side of the ball. I mean, I gave you just listed the players for you. The offense, has some talent. Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall are both very good players. On paper, the offensive line, if all the pieces come together and everybody stays healthy, could be quite formidable. I think the hope is certainly that Aaron Rodgers is going to be better than Peyton Manning was in 2015. And I think that it's a pretty good bet that Aaron Rodgers is going to be better than Peyton Manning was in 2015. Now, Is it realistic to expect MVP Aaron Rodgers? I don't know. I feel like we might be in a scenario where Aaron Rodgers is in decline, but because the pieces are around him are so good that they can kind of compensate for what you've lost. So look, if the Jets are good this year, I actually do think Rodgers will be in the MVP race. But I think like he's going to lean on his supporting cast more than he has at any point in his career. I think that Rodgers is going to require some adjustments to the way he plays. Everybody always talks about Tom Brady playing great into like his mid 40s. Brady's game was built to age very well because Brady's game was built zero on mobility. Brady's game was all based on smarts, on toughness, on his arm strength, his ability to maneuver within the pocket. Brady was never a guy who was really going to do a whole lot as a runner. He wasn't really going to extend many plays with his legs, but Brady just could find the soft spot in the pocket. He could slide left or right. He could, of course, he was famous for stepping up in the pocket. Rodgers' game has been a little bit more diverse through his career. He's been a guy who's utilized his mobility more. Maybe not as a guy who you design rushes for. He could scramble, but the biggest thing with Rodgers, it was buying time, and I don't know he's going to be able to do it at that level this year. And I think that that's why it's important the Jets have built a really solid infrastructure around him, and that includes the defense. When you talk about the offensive side of the ball, if the offensive line holds up, let's hope the offensive line holds up. And I think there's a chance the offensive line could hold up. If Rodgers is confined to the pocket, as long as you have a good offensive line blocking for him, which he's had through much of his career, he's still smart enough to get the ball where it needs to go. He'll figure out what the defense is doing. He will have like that, even when Peyton Manning was washed up. And again, I'm not saying Rodgers is washed up. Even when Peyton Manning was washed up, he still knew how to get the Broncos in the right play. He could still read a defense pre-snap and figure out the right play to be in. Manning couldn't always get the ball where it needed to go. I think Rodgers will be able to. And the Jets can lean on Breece Hall. I don't know that Denver, Denver had a playmaker like Breece Hall at the running back position. Denver had some receivers in 2015, but I don't know that they had a running back they could lean on like the Jets can lean on Breece Hall. So I think the teams are a little bit different. I think the Jets, if everything clicks this year, there's nothing that's stopping the Jets from having a big year. And Denver was a very lopsided team. And as much as people always try and say, oh, you should build around offense these days. And a decade ago, maybe people were saying you should try and build around defense. If you look at the great teams in the league, it's usually not one side of the ball that dominates. I mean, yeah, there's always the odd exception. The Denver in 2015 was one of those exceptions. But generally speaking, the teams that are big winners are very good on both sides of the ball. So I think it's tough to win the way Denver did. And part of that's just because, you want to have both an offense and a defense, because you may have an off day at one point, and that off day could come in the playoffs. So if your defense has an off day, you want an offense that can put up 30, 40 points. If your offense has a rough day, you want a defense that can hold the other team to 14, 15 points on a good day. So I think that the Jets have, and I would hope that they'll have better balance than Denver. Yeah, I mean, look, the injury risks are there. I think if we're being honest, there are a lot of – this is a team with a lot of variable outcomes this year, the 2024 Jets, because they have so many older players and so many players with injury histories. And, there have been studies done, like pretty much every study done is suggested that the two factors that are most likely to predict future injuries are an injury history and age. And the Jets have both of those. But, I think – I like the comparison because the Jets are a team that, clearly the defense is the better of the two units, and Denver was like that in 2015. But I don't think the Jets defense is quite as good as the Denver defense in 2015. But I think their offense should be I would hope it's going to be much better than Denver's offense in 2015. And maybe that'll be the difference. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, well, we're not done comparing. The Jets made a trade for a big name, Hassan Reddick, this offseason. How does he compare with another player the Jets brought in, another relatively big name that they brought in a few years ago to play a similar role? We'll discuss that continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Our episode of Locked On Jets today is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. We've been talking about some of the players the Jets brought in this offseason. Fortunately, the Jets have a scouting staff and a front office, so they don't need LinkedIn. But unfortunately, your business probably doesn't have the network of scouts or the ability to sign free agents the way the Jets do. So That's why you got to check out LinkedIn. LinkedIn is not just a jobs board. LinkedIn helps you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role. In a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. Hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. And LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and may not have the time or resources to hire. So LinkedIn is constantly finding new ways to make the process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you every day, as this is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, we're doing a special mailbag. There's one listener who hasn't been able to submit questions and submitted a bunch this week when I asked for them. So to thank him for all of his questions, we're doing a mailbag with just his questions. Our next question, how do you think the upside we expected with Carl Lawson before he got injured compares to Hassan Reddick's baseline expectations? And those were two very different scenarios, I think. When the Jets got Lawson, I think, first of all, it was kind of an upside play. He was a guy who was very productive during his career with the Bengals. He never really produced a ton of sack totals, but his pressure rates were always quite high. And the reason that's significant is, the more research that's done on this, the more you find that high pressure rates usually lead to high sack rates. If you have a high pressure rate and a low sack total, the odds are your sack total is going to go up in the future. And that's because, generally speaking, a pressure happens when a defensive lineman does something good. Defensive lineman beats his blocking assignment. And a sack happens when the offense does something wrong. And namely, the quarterback should, not always, but in many cases, the quarterback should throw the ball away, or he should find his hot route. He should do something to avoid a sack, or maybe step up, or do something to evade the sack. So really, when we talk about evaluating defensive linemen, sacks are important, but pressures are what lead to sacks. And I think the Jets were hoping Carl Lawson would have a breakout. I think expectations are higher, though, with Reddick, because he's been one of the top pass rushers in the NFL the last 4 years. I mean, he's been up there with anybody when you look at the sack totals. And I think that with Lawson, part of the scenario with Lawson is that there weren't really a ton of big names available to the Jets. I mean, the other guy who was mentioned, who in retrospect, total hindsight, they probably should have signed, was Trey Hendrickson, who ended up signing with Cincinnati. Hendrickson started in New Orleans, had his breakout season in his contract year, signed with the Bengals. The Bengals signed him to replace Lawson, and Hendrickson's been outstanding ever since. So I think, like with Lawson, the other aspect of this is they were just looking for a pass rusher because they really did not have an edge rusher. And when Lawson got injured that first year, so the Jets signed Lawson in 2021, and he got injured in training camp that year. It was a joint practice with the Green Bay Packers the Jets conducted before a preseason game in Green Bay. I mean, that was a really big hit. That may have been the player at that point in time the Jets could least afford to lose, because they had no other pass rushers off the edge. So Lawson was asked to step in and really be the guy. Reddick, I mean, is going to be the guy, but there's a lot of other talent around him. I mean, I think if Will McDonald develops, the Jets will be able to roll 3 deep at the defensive end position. So it's a little bit different. I think there are a lot of differences between the two scenarios. I think, you were talking about Lawson. There wasn't really as much available. There wasn't a Reddick caliber player available. With Lawson, you were looking more for just projections. It wasn't that Lawson had dominated to the extent Reddick had, and Lawson was put in a situation where he was a really critical player. Reddick's a critical player, no question about it, but the Jets at least have something behind him. Just have a lot behind him if things don't go well. If this contract situation doesn't play out, or heaven forbid Reddick gets injured, the Jets are at least in a better spot. So, I mean, I think that there are probably more differences than similarities with this, but obviously both big time additions. The Jets are looking to upgrade their defensive end spot. Next question: why could the Jets have not kept Becton as a guard? Is the Eagles line coaching so much better that they find upside when we can't? What traits make a good guard versus a good tackle? Okay, so a couple of questions there. Why could the Jets not have kept Becton as a guard? I just think that relationship had run its course. There clearly was a lot of bad blood between Becton and the coaching staff, and this goes back years. I mean, you could even go back to 2021 when the Robert Saleh coaching staff took over. There were early signs that, like, the player and the coaching staff were not seeing eye to eye on things. Things got worse. Mistrust built. I mean, everything indicates that after that first injury in 2021, Becton comes back in 2022, and he gets injured again in training camp. And he kind of got the feeling, based on reports that have come out, the coaching staff kind of blamed Becton because they felt like Becton was not in proper condition. Becton went out and openly blamed the coaching staff. So I just think that there was too much bad blood. And then last year, Becton's year was just bad. It wasn't any good. So I don't think that there was any way this relationship was salvageable. I think that both sides just needed a fresh start. So I don't think the Jets would have brought Becton back as a guard. Is the Eagles line coaching so much better that they find upside where we can't? How much upside does Becton have? We'll see. I mean, there's a lot of buzz in the summer that doesn't pan out. I know Becton's getting a lot of love from the media in Philadelphia right now. Let's see how he plays. But if your question is the Eagles coaching staff on the offensive line so much better than the Jets? Well, the answer is yes, because the Jets have Keith Carter. The Eagles have real coaches. So we'll see what happens there. And then the last question in this cluster was, what traits make a good guard versus a good tackle? And I think Becton moving to guard probably makes sense, because when you're playing tackle, you're facing you don't really have help on the outside. When you're at guard, you have a tackle next to you and you have a center next to you. So, you can pass. If somebody beats you to your inside or your outside, you can pass them off. When you're the tackle, you don't have any help to your outside. So you're one-on-one. And a lot of these edge rushers line up really wide, which means you have to be pretty quick and pretty athletic to get out to meet them. And it was clear last year, and maybe it was the knee, maybe it wasn't. But Becton was having a lot of issues with that. And when you play guard, you're lining up more against the big guys, like the 300-pound defensive tackle type. So it's more about power. So, in that sense, I could see where Becton may be a better fit at guard, because, he's not going to his lack of athleticism, his athletic deficiencies aren't going to hurt him as much at guard, because he's not going to have to protect as wide of an area. He's not going to have to kick out as wide as he would at tackle. It'll be up against power guys. And, to the extent, I mean, I don't think Becton played with a lot of power last year, but to the extent Becton has a skill set, it should be playing with power. I think the challenge with Becton is he's 6'7". And, it's a cliche in football, and it's true, especially inside in the trenches. Low man wins. The guy who gets lower is the one who's able to get all the leverage. And when you're 6'7", it's tough to be the low man. So I think that could be the issue Becton has playing guard. But I do think that I just don't think that this was a salvageable relationship, especially, I think the last gasp was last year when Becton came back, and, the Jets really didn't do anything else, and he had to play right tackle, and it just didn't go very well for him. I think both sides were ready to move on. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to Robert Saleh. What does he do well? What does he not do well? I'll tell you my thoughts. I'm not a huge fan. I do think there are a couple redeeming qualities, and we'll get into them continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. You love sports. We love them so much that we never want them to stop. But as the playoffs have wound down, we now get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like we want them to. But FanDuel can help you keep the sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime you're in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a booster bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And the Yankees and Mets are both in action. The All-Star break, including in Major League Baseball, both teams trying to make a push as we get into the later part of the summer, as we near the trade deadline. And FanDuel has you covered. Go to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Thursday, we're doing a special mailbag today. Our next question: what do you think Robert Saleh's best and worst qualities as a coach are at this point? I'm not a huge Saleh fan. I have to admit it. I mean, the guy's been here 3 years, hasn't had a winning season. It's very rare you go 3 years with losing records back to back to back and keep your job. If we're talking about his best qualities as a coach, I mean, look, he's implemented his defense very effectively. And if you want to give credit to Jeff Ulbrich, fine. But you remember, Saleh's the one who brought Ulbrich in. They're kind of like implementing the infrastructure of the Saleh defense. Like the Saleh principles are very much alive in this defense. I think the Jets have done a very good job building their defense. I think that there's been I think there's been a lot of cohesiveness with the front office when we're talking about the players Saleh wants them to bring in, especially on the defensive line. I think they've done a pretty good job developing defensive linemen. I mean, John Franklin Myers went from a rotational player into a quality starter. Jermaine Johnson had his breakout season last year. Quinton Williams took his game to the next level under this coaching staff. So I think when you're talking about the defensive side of the ball, and especially the defensive line, this coaching staff has done an outstanding job, and that's a credit to Saleh, because Saleh is the guy who implements everything. He's the guy who provides the vision. When it comes to what I don't like, I mean, I go with pretty much everything else. I mean, there's hires on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, I know Hackett's here in part because of Rodgers, but I think Saleh hired him because he was his buddy. I don't like the way Saleh's made excuse. I feel like Saleh's been an excuse maker. Look, we all know the Jets had a tough break last year. It's a break that teams can't recover from. But there's a difference. So when Aaron Rodgers goes down last year, it's fair to say, okay, maybe we're not a Super Bowl contender anymore. I think there's a big gap between that and our offense can't function on a basic level. And they just couldn't figure that out. I feel like Saleh was just kind of content to blame. And this is part from reporting that's come out since then. It just kind of feels like the Jets organization just kind of gave up. They didn't change the offense at all. They kept saying that this is the Aaron Rodgers offense. Well, Zach Wilson's a quarterback. Zach Wilson can't run the Aaron Rodgers offense. I don't know if there's an offense Zach Wilson can run. He certainly couldn't run what the Jets were asking him to run last year. But it just kind of felt like once Rodgers went down, they were ready to make excuses. And again, there was reporting that came out after this. And this stuff really soured me on Saleh. And I think he's not aggressive enough in his in-game decision-making. He doesn't go for it on fourth and short enough. I think he makes a lot of very bad decisions as a game manager. I mean, I look at this. I think Saleh. Here's my issue with Saleh is that all the good stuff I say, all the things I say are about positive attributes for Saleh. Those are the things you'd use to describe a really good defensive coordinator, not the things you'd use to describe a head coach. There's a lot lacking with Saleh. And look, he's got an opportunity this year to turn it around. He's got an opportunity this year to flip the narrative. But he's been around long enough where I think we can judge him and we can say, there's a lot that needs to improve with Robert Saleh if this is going to be a successful coaching tenure. And look, it's great. There's no excuses now. He's got Rodgers at quarterback. He's got this roster that looks really talented. There's really no excuse for this team to not have a big year. So, I mean, I don't want to hear it from Saleh this year. You've made excuses for 3 years. It's time to go out and win. And our last question, thinking about the salary cap, wouldn't it be better for everyone if players that were out for the season had some of the salary cap returned to their teams? This would be more guaranteed money for the players because it's less risky for teams, more money for older veterans with more injury risks, more money for middling players that can fill in for injured players later in the season, and less lost seasons for teams/fans because of injuries out of their control. So the question essentially is, if a player gets injured, should we not count his salary against the salary cap? Everything you said is accurate. I mean, all of that is true. It would be better for the players because there'd be more money to throw around. It'd be better for the fans because you get to see your team sign more players. The issue is it's not better for the owners because that's more money they have to pay out. So I don't think you get the owners on board with this plan. I actually like the idea because it's kind of tough to have a big name eating up a ton of your salary cap when he's on IR the whole year. It'd be like a Rodgers getting injured week 1, and then you lose all that salary cap space, and it's not really doing you any good because he's on. I know most of Rodgers' cap hit is deferred anyway, but the Jets will eventually have to pay for it, and essentially the Jets will be paying for a full year where against their cap where Rodgers played 4 snaps. Is that really fair? I think there's something to the idea that you change it up, and if a player's out injured, his salary doesn't count against the cap. He still gets paid, but it doesn't count against the cap. The problem is the owners don't want to cut more checks. So essentially, what you're asking the owners to do is you're asking them to pay more money because now you have all this extra cap space that has to be spent. The only way you can spend it is giving a player a new contract. So I don't think the owners would like it. I like the idea, but I don't think it'll ever come to be because it's not beneficial for the owners. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to close out the week.